Every small town has its secrets, and Brookhaven was no exception. At first glance, it was an ordinary, quiet place. Familiar faces at the diner, church bells on Sundays, and the hum of polite conversation in the local grocery store. And at the center of that store was Sean, the friendly cashier everyone loved. Sean had charm. With his disarming smile and boyish good looks, he could light up a room. Young women flocked to his line, laughing at his jokes, brushing their hair back when he complimented them. "Sean's so sweet," they'd say. But they didn't know what Sean did after the store closed. Lila was one of the many women who knew Sean. She was 23, worked as a waitress at the diner, and had her usual grocery run on Wednesday evenings, right after her shift. Sean always seemed to notice her, always made her feel special. "You're going to spoil yourself with all those desserts," he teased once, as he scanned a box of cookies. Lila laughed, brushing him off. But when she left the store that night, she felt off. It started with a sound. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, following her as she walked home. Brookhaven was small enough that almost everyone walked everywhere, and the streets were quiet at night. Too quiet. Lila turned, her eyes scanning the empty road behind her. Nothing. But the feeling wouldn't go away, that nagging sensation that someone was watching her. By the time she reached her apartment, she was nearly running. She locked the door behind her and let out a shaky breath, laughing at herself. "Get a grip," she muttered. But when she glanced out the window, her stomach dropped. Across the street, just barely visible under the dim glow of the streetlight, was a figure, standing perfectly still, watching. The next day, Lila told herself it was nothing. A shadow, a passerby, maybe her own imagination. She went to work, served the same faces, and heard the same gossip. But when she walked into the store that evening, Sean was there, flashing her that same easy smile. "You look tired," he said, his tone soft. "Long shift." Lila forced a smile, but something in his eyes unsettled her. It was subtle, barely there, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something she didn't. The next few nights passed uneventfully, until Saturday. Brookhaven had its own small bar, the kind of place where locals gathered to unwind. Lila had plans to meet a friend there, but when she arrived, the crowd was bigger than usual. She spotted Sean almost immediately, leaning against the bar, chatting with a group of women. His presence was magnetic. People seemed to gravitate toward him. But when his eyes met hers, Lila's blood ran cold. There was something in the way he looked at her, intense, predatory, as if the noise and the crowd didn't exist anymore. She turned away, pretending not to notice. But when she looked back, Sean was gone. Lila didn't stay long. The noise, the laughter, it was all too much. She said goodbye to her friend and stepped out into the cool night air. The streets eerily empty again. The walk home was short, but every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. When she reached her apartment, she stopped short. The door was ajar. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside, her hands trembling. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The living room was exactly as she'd left it. The kitchen, too. But when she entered her bedroom, she froze. On her nightstand, where she always kept a book, was a single Polaroid photo. It was a picture of her, taken from outside her window. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. A text, from an unknown number. "You looked beautiful tonight." Lila's breath caught as she stared at the screen. She ran to the window, her hands shaking, but the street outside was empty. Whoever had sent the message was gone. But not far. Lila barely slept that night. The text replayed in her mind over and over, twisting her thoughts into paranoia. She double-checked her locks, pulled the curtains tight, and left the lights on, but none of it helped. She wasn't just scared. She felt hunted. By morning, she told herself it had to be a prank. Someone at the diner could have overheard her conversation about the Polaroid photo and decided to mess with her. Brookhaven was small. Gossip traveled faster than cars. But the thought didn't settle her nerves. Her apartment building was an older one, the kind where the walls were too thin, and the hallways smelled faintly of mildew. It was usually quiet, save for the occasional argument from the couple in 3B or Mrs. Fisher's blaring daytime soap operas upstairs. That morning, though, the building felt different. Empty. On her way to work, she hesitated outside the grocery store. Sean was standing outside, leaning casually against the brick wall. He saw her and smiled, a boyish grin that would have been charming if it didn't make her stomach turn. "Morning," he said. Lila nodded stiffly and hurried past. "See you later," he called after her. The words clung to her like a shadow. At the diner, the shift passed in its usual blur of coffee orders and conversations she wasn't really listening to. But midway through the day, something strange happened. Mrs. Fisher, her upstairs neighbor, came in for her usual turkey sandwich. She hesitated before leaving, looking at Lila with an odd expression. "Everything all right?" Mrs. Fisher asked, her tone quiet. "Yes, I'm fine," Lila replied automatically. "You've been hearing it too, then?" Mrs. Fisher said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lila froze. "Hearing what?" Mrs. Fisher frowned. "The footsteps. Outside your door. They've been pacing for days now." Lila's stomach twisted. "You're sure?" Mrs. Fisher nodded. "At night. Always at night." Then she left, leaving Lila with her thoughts spinning. When Lila got home that evening, the building's hallway lights were dim, flickering slightly. She stared at her apartment door as she approached, the skin on her arms prickling. Nothing looked out of place, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. Everything looked exactly as she'd left it. The kitchen counters were clean, her living room untouched. But in the corner of the room, near the small window that overlooked the street, was her coat rack. One coat was missing. Lila froze, her eyes scanning the apartment. The air felt colder, heavier, like she wasn't alone. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. No answer. She checked the bedroom, the bathroom, even the closet. Nothing. But as she moved through the apartment, she noticed something strange. Her bedspread had been pulled back, just slightly, as if someone had been sitting there. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone and texted Kara. "Something's wrong. Can I stay with you tonight?" Kara's reply came almost instantly. "Of course. Are you okay?" Lila didn't answer. She packed a small bag, locked her apartment, and left without looking back. At Kara's place, Lila finally exhaled. Her best friend lived in a newer building across town, with modern locks and a doorman. It felt safe. "You really think someone's in your apartment?" Kara asked as they sat on the couch. Lila nodded, her fingers twisting the edge of her blanket. "Then you need to call the cops," Kara said firmly. Lila hesitated. She didn't have proof, not really. And what would they do? Come and find an empty apartment? She shook her head. "I'll handle it if it happens again." Kara didn't look convinced, but she dropped it. That night, Lila finally started to relax. The weight in her chest eased as they watched an old movie, laughing at the cheesy dialogue. But just as she was about to drift off to sleep, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She grabbed it, expecting another message from Kara or a spam email. It wasn't. The text was from an unknown number. "Forgot something?" Her blood ran cold. Attached to the message was a photo. It was taken in her apartment. Her coat, the one she'd noticed missing, was draped over the back of a chair, and on the table next to it was her apartment key. "Lila?" Kara asked, noticing her pale face. Lila handed her the phone without a word. Kara's expression shifted from confusion to horror. "We're calling the police," she said, her voice firm. But before either of them could move, Lila's phone buzzed again. The next text read, "Too late. I'm already here." Kara froze, staring at the message. "Check the door," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Kara nodded, walking to the door with shaking hands. She peered through the peephole, her breath catching. "What is it?" Lila asked, her heart pounding. Kara turned slowly, her face pale. "There's someone standing in the hallway." The knock came seconds later, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the quiet apartment. Neither of them moved. The knock came again, louder this time. And then, a voice. "Lila, I know you're in there." The knock came again, louder this time, rattling the door in its frame. "Lila," the voice repeated, soft but deliberate. "Let me in." Her blood ran cold. Kara backed away from the door, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. "Who is that?" she whispered. Lila shook her head, her breath shallow. "I don't know," she lied, but deep down she did. The doorknob jiggled. Once, twice. Then the voice spoke again, sharper now. "I just want to talk." Kara's eyes darted to Lila's phone, still sitting on the coffee table. "Call the cops." Lila grabbed the phone with trembling hands, her fingers fumbling over the screen as she dialed. 911. "What's your emergency?" "There's someone outside," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's trying to get in." The operator's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Stay on the line. Officers are on their way." "Is the door locked?" "Yes," Lila said. The jiggling stopped, replaced by heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing the hallway. And then, silence. Kara peeked through the peephole again, her breath hitching. "He's gone," she whispered. "Are you sure?" Lila asked, her stomach twisting. Kara nodded, but her expression didn't ease. "He left something." Lila crept to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. The hallway was quiet. Kara motioned for her to look through the peephole. First, she didn't see anything, but then her eyes dropped to the floor. A single piece of paper was propped against the base of the door, its edges slightly crumpled. Lila's heart pounded as she stared at it. "What is it?" Kara asked. "I don't know," Lila said, her voice trembling. The operator's voice cut in. "Are you still there? Officers are en route. Don't open the door." Lila nodded, though the warning wasn't necessary. There was no way she was opening that door. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The operator stayed on the line, reassuring them that help was close, but every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the floorboards, made Lila flinch. Finally, there was a knock at the door. "Brookhaven PD," a voice called. Kara peered through the peephole and exhaled in relief. "It's them," she said, unlocking the door. Two officers stepped inside, their presence filling the small apartment. The taller of the two, Officer Mendez, glanced down at the paper on the floor. "What's this?" he asked, bending to pick it up. Lila's stomach churned as he unfolded it. The paper was blank, except for a single word scrawled in the center. "Run." Mendez frowned, exchanging a look with his partner. "Do you know who might have left this?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Lila hesitated. Kara answered for her. "It's her neighbor from the grocery store, Sean." The officers jotted down the name but didn't look convinced. "We'll do a sweep of the building," Mendez said. "Lock the door behind us." The officers left, and Kara turned to Lila, her face pale. "That's him, isn't it?" Lila nodded, her chest tight. "I don't understand how he knew I was here." Kara's voice trembled. "He's been following you. He probably followed you here last night." An hour passed, then two. The officers didn't return, and Lila's fear only grew. Kara tried to reassure her, but she could see the cracks in her friend's confidence. "I'm going to make tea," Kara said, disappearing into the kitchen. Lila sat on the couch, staring at the door. The apartment felt too quiet. The silence broke with a crash. Lila jumped to her feet, her heart racing. "Kara?" she called, rushing to the kitchen. The window above the sink was shattered, the cold night air pouring in. Kara was gone. "Kara!" Lila shouted, her voice cracking. She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed 911 again. Before the call connected, her screen lit up with a new message. It was from the same unknown number as before. "I told you not to run." Attached was a photo. It was Kara, her hands bound, sitting in the passenger seat of a car. The background was dark, but Lila recognized the street. It was just outside the apartment. She dropped the phone, her knees buckling. Her breath came in short gasps, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They were inside the building now, echoing in the stairwell. Lila grabbed a knife from the kitchen, her hands shaking. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped outside her door. A shadow moved under the crack of the door. Then came the knock, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the apartment. "Lila," Sean's voice called softly. "I know you're in there." Her phone buzzed again. A video. She clicked it with trembling hands. It was Kara, sitting in the car, her eyes wide with terror. Behind her, through the windshield, Lila could see the faint glow of her own apartment window. Lila couldn't breathe. Her eyes darted from the knife trembling in her hand to the door. The sound of Sean's soft, deliberate knocking rattling through her skull. "Lila," he called again, his tone unnervingly calm. "You've been ignoring me. That's not very nice." Her phone buzzed again, the screen glowing faintly in the dim apartment. Another message. This one was a voice note. With shaking fingers, she tapped it open. Sean's voice filtered through the speaker, calm and deliberate. "You can run, but I'll always find you. Always." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the phone, her mind racing. "Lila, open the door," Sean said, his voice suddenly sharp. The doorknob rattled violently, the lock holding firm. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice breaking. For a moment, everything was silent. Then Sean laughed. Low and hollow, the sound cut through her like a blade. "You've always been my favorite," he said. "But I don't think Kara understands that. Maybe I'll have to show her." The sound of his footsteps retreated, fading into the stairwell. Lila's hands shook as she grabbed her phone, dialing 911 for the second time that night. "911, what's your emergency?" "There's someone in my building," she gasped, her voice frantic. "He's taken my friend. He's outside right now." The operator's tone was steady, but it did little to calm her. "Stay where you are, lock the door, and wait for the officers. They're already on their way." But Lila couldn't wait. She couldn't sit there while Sean did God knows what to Kara. She grabbed her coat and slipped out the window onto the fire escape, her bare feet freezing against the icy metal. The alley below was silent, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the brick walls. She climbed down carefully, every creak of the ladder echoing in the stillness. When she hit the ground, she ran. The streets of Brookhaven were deserted, the shops and houses dark, their occupants oblivious to the nightmare unfolding around them. Lila's heart pounded as she scanned the street, her breath visible in the cold air. And then she saw it. Sean's car, parked at the edge of the road. The engine was running, its exhaust curling into the night. Lila ducked into the shadows, her eyes fixed on the vehicle. Through the windshield, she could see Kara, her head slumped forward, her face pale. Sean wasn't in the car. Lila crept closer, her knife clutched tightly in her hand. Her heart raced as she reached the passenger door. "Kara," she whispered, tapping on the glass. Kara's eyes fluttered open, her expression shifting from confusion to terror. "Behind you," she mouthed. Lila spun around, but it was too late. Sean was there, his hand closing around her wrist like a vice. "You really should have stayed inside," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. She screamed, lashing out with the knife, but Sean was fast. He twisted her arm, the blade clattering to the ground. "You've made this so much harder than it needed to be," he said, dragging her toward the car. Lila kicked and struggled, her screams echoing down the empty street. For a moment she thought no one would come. But then, headlights appeared in the distance, followed by the wail of a siren. Sean froze, his grip loosening just enough for Lila to pull free. "Stay here," he hissed, his eyes wild, before disappearing into the shadows. Lila stumbled to the car, yanking the door open and pulling Kara into her arms. The police cruiser screeched to a halt, two officers jumping out, their guns drawn. "He's here," Lila shouted, her voice frantic. "He went that way." The officers disappeared into the alley, their flashlights cutting through the dark. Lila held Kara tightly, tears streaming down her face as the reality of what had just happened hit her. Minutes later, the officers returned, their expressions grim. "He's gone," one of them said. "But we'll find him." Lila's relief was short-lived, because as she glanced at the car's rearview mirror, she saw something that made her stomach drop. On the back seat, half hidden beneath a blanket, was a Polaroid photo. It was a picture of her and Kara, taken from the fire escape, minutes before she'd climbed down. The photo in the back seat wasn't just proof that Sean had been watching them. It was a warning. Sean had taken it while she was still inside Kara's apartment, while she thought she was safe. Lila's hands shook as she clutched the photo, her breath catching in her throat. "He's not gone," she whispered, her voice trembling. The officers searched the area again, but it was futile. Sean knew the town's back alleys and shortcuts far better than they did. "We'll station someone outside your apartment," Officer Mendez said. His tone meant to be reassuring. "And we'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow to give a full statement." But Lila didn't feel safe. She didn't feel safe anywhere. That night, she stayed at Kara's place again, the officers promising to circle the block throughout the night. But when the sun rose the next morning, Lila knew Sean wasn't done. Her phone buzzed as she sipped her coffee, the sound making her flinch. It was another text, this one with a photo attached. The image was of her apartment door. The caption read, "Miss me." Kara grabbed the phone from Lila's shaking hands. "We have to go to the cops. Now." Lila nodded, her throat too tight to speak. At the station, the officers took her phone and promised to track the number. "We've dealt with cases like this before," Mendez said. "Guys like him get sloppy eventually." But that wasn't good enough for Lila. She wanted Sean caught, before he could hurt anyone else. By the time she returned to Kara's apartment, exhaustion weighed on her like a heavy blanket. She collapsed onto the couch, her eyes closing almost immediately. But her sleep was anything but peaceful. She dreamed of Sean, his grin, his voice, the way his grip had felt like iron around her wrist. When she woke, the room was dark, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. "Kara?" she called, her voice groggy. No response. Lila sat up, her stomach tightening. "Kara?" she called again, louder this time. Still nothing. She grabbed her phone, the screen casting a faint glow in the dark room. Her heart sank when she saw the time. 3:17 a.m. And there was another text waiting for her. This one had no words, just a photo. It was taken inside Kara's apartment. Lila's breath caught as she recognized herself, asleep on the couch, the blanket pulled up to her chin. Her phone slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor. She scrambled for the nearest light switch, flicking it on. The apartment was empty, eerily quiet. But the front door, the deadbolt, was unlocked. Her hands trembled as she locked the door, double-checking it twice before backing away. Her phone buzzed again, the vibration loud against the hardwood floor. She didn't want to pick it up, but she had to. The new text read, "Turn around." Lila froze, her body stiff with fear. The room was silent, her ears straining for any sound. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, her breath coming in shallow gasps. And then she felt it, a faint, cold breath against the back of her neck. She spun around, the knife from earlier still clutched in her hand. But the room was empty. She backed into the corner, her phone in one hand, the knife in the other, her eyes scanning every shadow. "Leave me alone!" she screamed, her voice breaking. But no one answered. The sound of sirens in the distance jolted her, and she realized she'd called 911 without even thinking. The seconds dragged on like hours, her chest tightening as she waited for help to arrive. The sirens grew louder, closer, and then they stopped. Someone knocked on the door. "Police!" a voice called. Lila hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "How do I know it's you?" she shouted. There was a pause. Then, "Lila, it's Officer Mendez. Open the door." She unlocked the door slowly, peeking out to see Mendez standing there, his face calm but concerned. "It's over," he said, stepping inside. "We got him." Her knees buckled as relief washed over her. What happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. "We found him near your apartment," Mendez explained. "He was trying to break in. He didn't resist." Lila nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," Mendez repeated, his tone steady. But deep down, Lila wasn't sure it ever would be. The man the police arrested was Sean, but they never found his phone. And 2 weeks later, Lila received another text from an unknown number. This one just said, "See you soon."